chapter 8, verses 31 through 33. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." This is the word of the Lord. This morning, I'm going to talk a bit about change. Not that change ever occurs here, right? We are in interesting times. Change is a constant of life. The Bible is full of stories of change, often unanticipated and not necessarily easy to deal with. A couple of stories come to mind. Imagine Moses coming down the mountain very happy with the 10 Commandments. And what does he find? Well, there's a golden calf there, and the people are very solicitous to it. Must have been an interesting hour or two. But anyway, that was a change that did not come to occur. And another is Jesus cautioning disciples not to discuss coming events that he had been talking about. He had talked about it, and he was deadly serious about it because he knew what was coming. And in that particular story, the disciples were trying to decide who of them was the greatest, which had nothing to do with what Jesus was talking about. But as time went on, they came to deal with that. There are a multitude of other stories of change. So the Word has always had changes that have provided problems, sometimes with solutions and sometimes without solutions. Change, as I've noted, is part of life. It's part of the job when you work out, and it's part of church life as we go through time. There's change, even if we are Presbyterians. You know, change? Can't change light bulb, change? Or the other favorite for Presbyterians is the frozen chosen. We tend to think that our lives run smoothly and predictably. Is that so? Let's see, most of your parents, of course, the kids never got sick at inconvenient times, and the situation had to be dealt with. Or got into mischief unannounced, causing interesting times. Even though I'm familiar with the mischief part, but that's a story for another day. I have heard that when kids are beginning to operate on their own as they mature, they often learn from the mistakes they make, eventually. And of course, parents understand saying nothing nor showing concern. Isn't that right? Wasn't in my house. Another illustration of change is, as most of you know, I worked in Tanzania and East Africa. That was during the late 70s and early 80s. And one of the things that greatly concerned people in power at that time, and citizens in general, was that South Africa's government had a policy of apartheid, which was long-term. It had started in 1949 and adversely affected black citizens of South Africa. It was turned them into second or third class citizens. By the time I was working in Tanzania, the policy had been around for over 25 years. The system of apartheid was certainly disliked totally by black South Africans. It was disliked by black Africans of other nationalities, and even by a substantial number of white South Africans, especially business people. And this was an interesting thing that I didn't realize until that time. But the thing about South Africa is that it's an economic engine that drives sub-Saharan Africa to a large part. It had a huge industrial complex that just needed lots of people. And lower-rung workers were easy to come by because, any black could do that. But the problem came in mid-level and upper-level management. The problem was that they needed an increasing number of managers, and there were not enough white South Africans. By that time, expatriates were hesitant to take jobs in South Africa. And the solution was before their eyes. There were any number of well-qualified black South Africans, but the result of apartheid was they couldn't be moved up into those positions. So the apartheid policy was known to lack adequate possibilities. The policy was challenged peacefully and violently by various groups, principally the ANC, the African National Union. There were any number of white South Africans who would say we must change. The government carried on kind of ignoring most of this. The common consensus was that the apartheid policy would have to go, but he persisted. Change was needed, but what to do? Another example of change. In the Presbyterian Church, female pastors were largely prohibited, as it was known they could not handle the job. Apparently, the story of Priscilla was added to the New Testament recently because one of our founding fathers, Paul, ran into a woman who could talk with him. And he eventually recognized her talents. It became apparent that there were not enough male pastors to serve all the churches. Senior leaders of the Presbyterian originally had to be male. It was important to have capable people. Then it became hard to find men for those jobs. What to do? From the above examples that we do not always have, we know that we do not always have an immediate solution. In fact, there were numerous suggested solutions, however those solutions often didn't work or were ignored. So the situation required being flexible, which was a key aspect, finding other solutions, often after reflection, that were originally not immediately obvious. The desire to find a solution was most important to resolve the problem and move on to run the system in a smooth and peaceful way. It didn't always happen. Sometimes the situation just festered and no one was happy. The situation in South Africa was a case in point. The apartheid policy carried on for years, with South Africans agitating for change, both violently and peacefully, and many white South Africans vocally calling for change. Nothing happened. Then in 1989, de Klerk, a white Boer, became president after being in office for a bit. He ordered Nelson Mandela. There had been conversations with people in the ANC, and one of the things that came up was Nelson Mandela's being held in a high security prison on Robben Island. De Klerk moved Mandela to a low security facility on the mainland. There were negotiations with ANC officials and Mandela over a 5-year period. During that time, apartheid laws were dismantled. Then in '94, elections were held with the vote being universal and Mandela running for president, among others. Mandela was elected president. The problem was solved by a strong leader, and de Klerk was not ultimately known as this, but he certainly is shown at that moment. The problem was solved by a strong leader who saw the well-known problem and who saw the solution to the problem that nobody thought was possible. De Klerk determined the impossible was possible and enacted it. It took time and patience, perseverance, but the solution succeeded. In regards to women serving as pastors in the church, this problem was solved, I think, more by just persistent presence of people pressing for change. And it was from males as well as females. The change was slow in coming at first, but gradual change was accepted. Gradually change was accepted. And then the change became widespread. Now there are roughly equal numbers of women and men serving as pastors. After I wrote that, I got to thinking about it. I think within the Syracuse Presbyterian, there are more female pastors than there are males. The church seemed to have survived. Two of the last three leaders of the Syracuse Presbyterian have been women. And the presbytery has started to deal with problems that will have to be solved if the presbytery is to continue to be effective. These examples demonstrate that the presence of change, either large or small, presents problems that may or usually may not have an obvious solution. For change to occur, a flexible and attentive attitude is required to seek functional solutions which may not be obvious at the time. In all of these cases, it's noted that dealing with change requires time and focus to resolve the problem that the change has required. The ability to deal with change depends on the strength and vision of the individuals involved to deal with the problems that change presented. This brings us to another important aspect of change: community. Community has been a central aspect of Christians throughout the history of Christianity. Even at the start, the 12 disciples and Jesus are an example of a well-functioning community. The associations among individuals within the community have had their ups and downs. It's certainly clear that Peter was not a shrinking violet. After all, he rebuked Jesus for telling him what was about to happen, and Peter got his own back. Peter's being a strong individual was important because after the crucifixion, he was the glue that held the community in Jerusalem together. Monastic associations were communities that looked after and supported large groups of Christians of various persuasions. These may have actually been monasteries. They were also groups of Christians of various sorts. The ones that we might think of today tend to be of a conservative bent. I think particularly of Hutterites, Amish, and Mennonites. In a larger sense, all of the mainline churches, Roman Catholic, and all the major Protestant churches are groups. They form communities. Some of them are weaker than others. Some of them are incredibly strong. Within these religious associations, it was the leader's duty to keep the association, the community, safe and well ordered. It's a tall order, but in general they succeed. Church congregations are communities of like-minded individuals who by their actions support the congregation, the community. While individuals within the congregation may have gifts that stand out, those gifts are to support the survival of the congregation or the community. They're not to highlight the individual per se. Hence, notions of community are central to the Christian faith. You know, all of this nice. What's it have to do with us? The congregation of this church, be it New Hope or Parish Hastings or First Presbyterian or Parish Presbyterian Church, has been a strong community for over a century. And there are two sides to what that means. A close-knit community can be very strong in supporting itself. The flip side of this is that the community can be so focused on itself that it eliminates the outside world. And the danger of that is that the outside world can just eliminate the congregation from its view. And the worst that can happen is that central inward focus results in a loss of membership. The result is that the community becomes isolated and withers. Now there's a piece of information that you hear from time to time. As stock traders say, past performance is no indicator of future returns. So if you put your money in, you take your chances. And that is a statement that's true. However, looking at past happenings is a way of gaining insight in what happened, and more importantly, how that worked out. Let's look at the past 65 years of our history. I chose this number of years since I can remember a large part of it. Unlike some of you, I'm a little bit older, you know. And this starts with when Joe Clark, who, does anybody remember Joe? We do have some. Welcome to my group. Joe is an interesting guy. He was a pastor here for only 5 years. I thought it was longer. But in that time, there was, by our standards, substantial church attendance. There were 20 to 30 folks in the pews most Sundays. He was a dynamic, older but dynamic pastor, full-time here. Ran a bus to pick up kids for Sunday school, almost unheard of now. and provide a vigorous church program. Regrettably, he left due to health problems, and the church wandered for a while. I was not here during that time, so I'll recount some of the things that I think happened. I know that there were numerous pastors that served 1 or 2 years, came and went. There was a 2-year effort at one point to join with the Parish Methodist Church. There was another period of 2 years when an effort was made to join the Mexico Presbyterian Church that was led by Earl Arnold. And there was an effort to join with the Hastings Church later on. That was led by Jerry Shave and Earl Arnold, as they served both churches concurrently. Earl was a pastor in Mexico, and he served the last 2 years of this group. And was the one who oversaw the uniting of the two churches. Just prior to Earl, both Parish and Hastings were pastored by Jared Shea for 14 years. That's an incredibly long tenure within the history of this church. While the first 2 efforts were unsuccessful, the last resulted after several years in the merging of the Hastings and Parish churches. As I've indicated, the 2 churches had the same pastor for a total of 16 years. Undoubtedly, that long period of common pastoring facilitated the congregations uniting to form Parish Hastings Presbyterian Church. It didn't take the entire 16 years, but it did take several years when we got to seriously talking about it. And the Parish Hastings Church held together for 13 years before we renamed. There were 2 pastors during that time, Susan Wilhelm, who many of you may not remember, but the other was Susan Alloway, who was here for 10 years, and I think most of you know Susan. She was a good old Texas gal who was able to talk nicely to people and keep most people happy. And she was a great benefit to the church. During that time, there was a gradual decrease due to death, and there was the occasional new arrival. We renamed to be New Hope Presbyterian, and during this tenure, we've had 2 pastors, Danny McAllister, who was here a couple of years, and then our pastor now, Lori. Lori's been here 7 years. I find that hard to believe. She's an incredibly effective pastor, and has a series of considerations, and she worries greatly about us. Anyway, as she's told us, she'll be leaving at the end of this month. And so, let's think about that. So what do we gain from this recounting of 6 decades of history? There was a substantial change as pastors came and went. those pastors that had notable effects on the church were long-term in their position. I'm sure that the congregation felt uncertain at times due to changes. However, the long-term pastors, which was over half of the total time, provided leadership and stability. The church community was faithful, and the church continued to function, even during the periods of frequent pastoral change. At the present time, we're going through a period of change. Lori's doing a fine job of causing us to look at our present situation and discerning what options we have. It's a fun time, isn't it, folks? We all will do our best to avoid dealing with it, but we're going to have to. This discernment will make us stronger as we more clearly see our way forward. And we will find a way, as has been done several times previously. This discovery or discernment will require that we are scrupulously honest, that we identify our weaknesses, and that we review all possibilities and use all of this as our strength to move forward. I know some people are concerned, and while there are things that we have to think about and worry, this is an exciting time in a positive sense. We will have our moments, but we